The premises for Ministry of Magic in Great Britain is located under the main streets of London, where Garrick Street becomes Bedford Street, in the space between the pavement and the underground network. Indistinguishable to moles and even, on occasions, to those of the magical persuasion, its actual physical dimensions are unfathomable for, while the seemingly miles of corridors, floors and departments span a vast physical area, the actual space it occupies in real terms is next to nothing. Perhaps then, this is why it is the location for the Ministry of Magic, and also why stupid authors shouldn't try to reason its existence. Nevertheless, its dimensions and size become more pertinent when we examine the location of an event which has not been held internationally for almost 500 years and never on British wizarding soil. So significant the event, so potentially far-reaching its consequences, and yet so subtle in its existence to the ignorant bustling crowds of moles and wizards 8 feet, and at the same time 3 miles, above the nature of the event has been kept, up until now, a secret to all but a few key wizards who will take a prime role in the establishment of a conclusion. Even the term event to describe the secret proceedings that are just about to unfold on this bright Saturday morning belittles its significance, for whatever is decided by the International Confederation of Wizards in a full trial. Its word is final and unconditional. Immovable. And carried out to the letter. Usually such trials whose outcomes are irretractable are carried out when magical ministries in any country feel that sweeping changes are an immediate necessity in order to implement swift legal and often controversial changes in the guise of civil protection by hand-picked interrogators and officials. Who's to say today's would be any different? To quote a very wise sorcerer, just because it is legal, doesn't make it right. The results of this particular full trial will, though unknowingly, permeate the lives of each and every person you have come across so far. Harry, at school with his friends Ron and Hermione, Minerva McGonagall, striding the halls and corridors of Hogwarts briskly if not slightly panicky, Hagrid in his hut, making a drink from what was once a tea bag, and is now a paper tea leaf mush, and cauldron boiled water. The conclusions will pervade the steel-hard exteriors of one or two of our less loved characters from a certain schoolhouse, one with the emblem not dissimilar to a lizard without legs, and their lives too will be affected, although not quite in the same way as the rest. And of course, those closest to the main subject of the trial, those intimately connected to her. Those whose lives have been affected, either good or ill, by her actions. Those whose futures interlink and intertwine closely with hers. It is those wizards who will be most affected. 88,888,888. The vast chamber, lit by thousands of standard candles arranged in clusters for maximum effect, displayed the receding banks of empty pews which, though empty, appeared to be filled with atmosphere. Not atmosphere, as in the mere ratios of volatile and inert gases that make up the air, but atmosphere, as if thousands of absent spectators were sitting perched on the edges of their seats eagerly waiting for the main protagonists to take their places. Amongst those seated, apart from ministry representatives and the minister himself, smoothing his long white beard and perched in the main chair suspended high above them all, was a small, unassuming and very elderly wizard who appeared to have a small flower tucked inside the brim of his official-looking blue wizard's hat. One or two of the representatives, sitting in the seats usually occupied by the prosecution in a criminal trial, exchanged glances as Pierre Benacourt flattened the flower's petals absently against the intersecting M and W which were embroidered on his hat as he perused the notes that had been thrust before him only moments ago. A small cough reverberated around the chamber, arising, it would appear, from the ministry section, and Albus Dumbledore, seated in the center of the chamber on a gold, high-backed chair, looked across at Cornelius Fudge, whose exasperated face of moments ago slid to ignorance as he began to take a keen interest in Benacourt's literary discourse of the case in hand. "So, what you're trying to tell me, Fudge, is that you've brought me out of retirement, out of 50 years of retirement, in order to preside over the very wizard who succeeded me. Albus Dumbledore?" From his chair, which looked far too large to accommodate him appropriately, Bernacourt looked at Fudge over his large spectacles, gesturing with his right hand at Dumbledore while casting a scathing look at the minister. Fudge shifted uncomfortably in his chair, ignoring the muttering that had begun around him as the ministry representatives began to whisper uncertainly. "With respect, ex-Supreme Mugwump," continued Fudge, every effort focused on keeping his voice firm and steady, "with the situation that we have here, and having already heard from the Chief Warlock himself that the Wizengamot of Great Britain cannot, regrettably, hear evidence on the matter." He glanced hurriedly at his deputy Algernon Gandy for self-assurance. "This is why you have been called upon today. Albus Dumbledore." Here, Fudge's eyes flicked momentarily onto Dumbledore, who was still sitting as serenely as he had done half an hour ago on the chair in the center of the chamber before releasing a humoring smile as he continued, "His role of Supreme Mugwump has been suspended, for clearly he cannot preside over his own trial." Around him, some of the ministry representatives nodded in silent agreement with Cornelius Fudge, though some more animatedly than others. Those who were remaining reserved simply sat arms folded and observant, uncomfortable at their own presence at the event and feeling that they would rather be a few thousand miles away taming dragons or something else less potent than sitting in a trial where Albus Dumbledore, most respected wizard, was to be brought into severe line by their ostentatious superior. "Yes, yes," continued Bernacourt, waving his hand towards the ministry representatives and listening as those who were whispering fall silent. "Indeed. All right, very well. HMPH, he exhaled, shuffling on the seat, and Fudge cast another look towards Dumbledore as his predecessor muttered something about rights for trolls, and the minister waited with veiled impatience for Bernacourt to direct the start of the trial. He didn't have to wait long, and he watched as the tiny wizard climbed to his feet and apparated himself to a standing position on his chair. All eyes in the courtroom looked upon him, recognizing that the beginning of the trial was imminent, and they watched him survey the entire courtroom omnisciently. "As appointed President and Honorary Supreme Mugwump, I hereby call to order." As he spoke, a door near the back of the ministry representatives opened and another joined the mass. Tabitha Penright had not intended to miss the beginning of the trial, but had been delayed in her return to the ministry following her visit home because of the heavy security in place, and she had just spent an hour negotiating with a security wizard to allow her access. As she shuffled slowly through the now standing throng of her colleagues towards Dolores Umbridge, Tabitha's gaze focused immediately on the Supreme Mugwump's opening words, hoping that no one would notice her tardy timekeeping. "State the context nice and clearly, Fudge, for the interrogators." Bernacourt gestured to a dozen high-status witches and wizards dressed in plum-colored robes with silver intersecting I and W on the sleeve which glittered in the lamplight. Tabitha, as with the rest of the wizards around her, looked the wizards, chosen from the International Wizengamot to act as jurors in the trial. Next to her, Tabitha realized that Dolores Umbridge had become aware that she had arrived, and had chosen to express her awareness by casting her a scolding glance. Immediately Tabitha felt her head duck lower, but before Umbridge had a chance to follow through her disapproval with words, she noticed her superior's attention had been drawn to the Supreme Mugwump's chair again and, more importantly, to the Supreme Mugwump himself, and she too looked in his direction. "We will start with the crime that Dumbledore here has been accused of. At a loss he looked down at the usher of the court, a slight witch with a pinched nose and round spectacles, who began to read from a parchment scroll that appeared in her hands. She looked vaguely at it for a moment before glancing back at Dumbledore. Around her, Tabitha felt the wizards around her focus on the trial again as those around her strained forward to be sure of catching all the words that the witch was about to declare, and, as she did so, it seemed to Tabitha as if the members of the Wizengamot full guard that were surrounding Dumbledore had, as one, taken a hasty step back. "Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, you have been accused. began the usher as she held the parchment firmly at arm's length, and silence reigned momentarily as the usher's clear crisp voice rang out and the echoes of her statements reverberated around the vast chamber of high wizardly treason. For presiding over a subversive group of wizards, and for engaging in illicit and unauthorized mul-wizard relations. For bringing danger to the students in your care. For knowingly and willfully exposing them to unsubstantiated and untested teachings. For being a reciprocator. When she had finished, the court usher looked up, glanced at Dumbledore before looking back at the Supreme Mugwump. It was his turn, Tabitha knew, to continue the trial, mediating the prosecution and defense until the issues had been heard and all was evident for the interrogators to discuss. Then the Supreme Mugwump would consider their verdict before passing an irrevocable, final judgment, not dissimilar to Mole courts, Tabitha recalled as her mind dug up a conversation she had had with her brother, who had made it his solemn duty since her shame of being a witch was discovered to educate her in the ways of the real world. But before Tabitha could remember further memories of her brother, however, her attention was drawn to the full trial again. The Supreme Mugwump was not directing the trial, and instead the focus was brought to the defendant. Dumbledore was chuckling quietly to himself. For a good few minutes the only thing that could be heard in the courtroom was the wizard's expressive laughter, which eventually died away to nothing as the look of shocked annoyance grew to silent anger on Cornelius Fudge's face. Benacord, however, looked impassive. Eventually Dumbledore spoke. "I apologize for my mirth, Supreme Mugwump. However, it is of utmost curiosity that I stand before you today on a charge of reciprocation under the laws of the British Ministry of Magic when, this government thought reciprocators to be a joke not so long ago." Dumbledore broke off at the hasty coughing coming from Fudge's vicinity and, glancing pointedly at the minister, returned his attention to Benacord before getting to his feet. "May I refer you to the information given, Supreme Mugwump, by Brunella Rand in the European Wizengamot in 1989, when she declared that the advancements achieved by moles in the town of Heimholtz could have come about through reciprocation? Something which the minister hastily dismissed. Like the spectators at a tennis match, the representatives of the ministry, the interrogators and even Benacord himself began to look between the two wizards as a non-verbal volley was beginning to swing into action. All eyes were on Fudge now, waiting for him to respond. They didn't have to wait long. Cornelius Fudge had got to his feet, trying to resist the urge to fold his arms defensively, and turned to the Supreme Mugwump. "You see, Benacord. You see? Even under the gravity of a full trial he is not taking this seriously. You were minister in 1989, were you not, Minister Fudge?" asked the Prime Inquisitor. A middle-aged witch with a Germanic accent got to her feet and pushed back a few stray brown hairs from her face. "Might you describe to the court, Minister Fudge, your verdict of the Heimholtz case?" "Well, I might have said she was silly. Fräulein Rand is stark staring bonkers, I believe you declared," said Dumbledore quietly. Yes, boomed Fudge dismissively. "But this has nothing to do with the case before you here today, Supreme Mugwump." At Fudge's words, Pierre Benacord nodded before turning to the defendant, who was still standing in the court and still wore a smile of serenity. "Of the charges brought against you, Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, how do you plead?" Around them, the low muttering of the ministry representatives died back to nothing, and they watched in rapt awe as Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore got to his feet, turning slowly to the usher of the court, who had directed the question to him. Under his gaze the usher returned an expression of impassive cool and collectedness, and she waited for Dumbledore to reply, anticipating his words patiently before faithfully recording them on the official parchment that hung before her, quill aloft. "Of being a reciprocator. I am guilty." He nodded slightly towards Benacord. "Of the other charges?" He cast a wry glance towards Fudge before returning to Benacord. "I cannot before. When the accused pleads that they are done for the good of Wizardkind, they are not recognized under the British wizarding law." A switch flicked in the back of Tabitha's mind. Of course. Of course Dumbledore would say this. Hadn't Dolores mentioned that he would mention something like that? Not like those were her exact words though, thought Tabitha, as she watched her boss get to her feet at almost exactly the same time as Cornelius Fudge, more like dash. A flimsy excuse, like I said, whispered Dolores Umbridge furiously in her descent heavily downwards next to Tabitha. Just wait till Cornelius. I mean Minister Fudge, of course, has his say dash. Smiling politely at nobody in particular, Tabitha turned consciously to stare at a patch on the floor, patently aware of the events that were continuing around her. She could feel the indignation that was irradiating as strongly from Umbridge as the mortification from Minister Fudge. The Supreme Mugwump for the trial had silenced the Minister for Magic and requested him to take his seat. Only when the muffled uncertainty from those wizards around her had died down and Pierre Benacourt had begun to speak did she dare re-engage with the proceedings, looking up at the tiny wizard who was staring intently at the accused. "And are you claiming this, Dumbledore?" Benacourt asked, voicing the unspoken question of probably all assembled. Heads of both the ministry representatives and the interrogators turned in kind to look at the suspended headmaster of Hogwarts School. "Indeed, Supreme Mugwump," Albus Dumbledore clarified, nodding deferentially at his predecessor. A snort came from the group of ministry representatives, which Benacourt and Tabitha patently ignored by the Supreme Mugwump, although for the latter it was far harder when the opposition had been expressed from her right-hand side and she watched as her boss glanced loyally at her boss, Fudge limiting his comment to pushing his spectacles up onto the bridge of his nose. Tabitha looked back to Benacourt, who had not shifted his glance from the defendant. "You are aware, Dumbledore, that in the same way that you are allowed to call all witnesses on defense and be represented by another in a national Wizengamot hearing, so are you here in the International Wizengamot?" "Indeed, sir. I remember feeling most happy when I got that one passed. Very fair, very fair." Benacourt cast his eyes towards Fudge before returning them back to Dumbledore. "You wrote the laws under which you now stand accused," he continued in his high-pitched but orderly French accent, "so you know about them. Please could you summarize then, in what manner you believe your actions of, and proceeding, the night of Lord Voldemort's return to be carried out for the good of Wizardkind?" "Certainly." Dumbledore nodded at Benacourt, before turning to address the Inquisitors, looking across their 3 rows of 4 wizards each, much as Tabitha had seen him do to much larger and younger audiences at Hogwarts, with similar results. Ignoring the downward glances and muted gasps that each of the distinguished officials had betrayed, he continued. "My actions were carried out primarily for the safety of Harry Potter and the dangers that surrounded him and indeed still do surround him." He broke off again and glanced around the courtroom as a Mexican wave of whispers began to ripple around the assembled wizards as Harry's name was repeated several times in a low mumbling. From the bank of ministry witnesses, from her place next to Tabitha, Umbridge got to her feet, casting an eye towards Dumbledore before turning with an expression of steely reason towards the Supreme Mugwump. "Yes, we wondered when he would be dragged into this," she commented, pushing her pair of seaside rock pink-framed spectacles up her nose as she examined the notes in front of her. Around them the courtroom fell silent and Tabitha began to pink slightly as the Inquisitors and the rest of the ministry representatives stared dumbly in her direction. Not at her though, for Dolores had managed to draw attention to herself all on her own, but it was because her interjection. It was highly unprecedented for anyone other than the prosecution or the Minister for Magic to address the Supreme Mugwump directly, even when he was present for Homeland Wizengamot trials. "Sit down," thought Tabitha desperately, "please sit down." And then Tabitha realized why her usually stickler for the rules boss had disregarded a rather large convention, and why the rest of her colleagues were staring in their direction so intently. For under Dolores Umbridge's pink-trimmed official robes she was wearing her undersecretary sash which had been embroidered with a bright pink P prosecution. Dolores was the prosecutor that Cornelius Fudge himself must have chosen. No wonder then, that she had expressed aloud her fervent disagreement to Dumbledore's earlier statements. You claim that in order to protect Harry Potter you entered into a reciprocal relationship? Peeling her eyes away from her boss, Tabitha's attention was drawn towards Dumbledore again. Well, it would be very difficult for me to state otherwise, Madam Prosecutor, for my act of claiming reciprocation from the Mole was entirely related to the rise and return of Lord Voldemort. I see, interjected Umbridge lightly. And how do we know Voldemort was making a comeback on the night? When was it? February 24th. She pushed her spectacles even further up her nose, which examining the parchment that she was holding. Other than the 27 eyewitnesses you mean? Can you explain, Albus, said Benacord, glancing in the direction of the ministerial seats as Cornelius Fudge got to his feet. Dumbledore's responses were obviously not modest or humble enough to please him. Yes, I would like to hear about your eyewitnesses as well, Dumbledore, said Fudge, in an accusing tone. So would we all, for the benefit of the ministry, echoed Umbridge shrilly, looking over her spectacles. Especially if their number consists of several of our own staff. Ministerial staff meeting secretly with you. And an escapee from Azkaban. And a half-breed. Now all of the court was looking at Umbridge, contemplating her last statement which she had uttered in undisguised triumph. A myriad of conversations began around them. The wizards around Tabitha were clearly interested in the secret meetings and who these dangerous members might have been. You do not deny then that you have in your employ a half-breed? Roared Fudge over the din. At once, the ministry representatives fell silent. Indeed I do not. Firenze the Centaur is a marvelous astronomy teacher. I do not mean the Centaur, boomed Fudge, clearly annoyed at Dumbledore's apparent evasion of the point, although employing half-breeds of any kind is questionable. I am referring to Dash. You want to know about the meetings? Well, I can assure everyone here that those in attendance were wizards who were met by and assisted your errors. And they are certainly not in my employ. They seemed very well informed, commented Umbridge, glancing at Fudge whose face was beginning to redden in badly disguised outrage as she sat down heavily next to Tabitha. Indeed they are. Most forthcoming were you to question them yourself. I wondered why you had not done so, Cornelius, when you had suspicions they were not as they should be. Why were they not interrogated after the great battle? It is not for the minister to have to answer questions. Dolores Umbridge returned hastily to her feet, snapping the reminder of protocol at Dumbledore. These meetings were illegal, as is the crime of employing half-breeds for covert and seditious purposes. Dumbledore paused, looking towards Benacord's chair as he waited for the echoes of Umbridge's screeched retort to die away. Then he looked back at her, his voice calm and even. If I am to defend myself, madam, then I must protest. Meetings between wizards are certainly not illegal. No. Dumbledore looked thoughtful. Otherwise the entire clientele of the Leaky Cauldron would surely be in Azkaban. It is illegal to meet to discuss reasonable things, and to plot subterfuge, replied Fudge hotly, glaring at Dumbledore and daring him to disagree. It would seem Dumbledore had taken the bet. He looked across at Umbridge, the prosecution to whom, by rights, he should have been directing his defense, before looking back at Fudge. Is it illegal for a few old associates and friends to meet up on a regular social basis to discuss politics? Current affairs? The state of the world? Illegal to share deep worries about the rise of an old evil? Well, you will provide us with details of these meetings, Dumbledore, especially the details of whom, or indeed what, were attending. Tabitha watched as Dumbledore smoothed his beard in a way she remembered him doing when she was a student at Hogwarts, usually when he was about to announce something, like the feast, or that a house other than her own, Hufflepuff, had won the House Cup, or that someone had mysteriously disappeared and whoever might have played a not very funny now practical joke would be wise to own up now. Fudge, however, looked on, resolute. "That is something that I've already done, and it would appear that the scant evidence requested previously by Undersecretary Umbridge detailing the goings-on at our tea parties up until February 24th was inadvertently destroyed by Ministry errors when we fought Voldemort and the Death Eaters." Dumbledore's eyes flitted briefly to the now lowering head of the Chieferer, sitting 3 places away from Fudge. A whisper began and he nodded his head a couple of times without looking up, and Fudge folded his arms in now evident fury before sitting back down. "Please continue, Dumbledore," prompted Benacord and gestured his hand towards him. Dumbledore nodded graciously. "However, it is through these events that I admit, I coerced and persuade others to join my foolish attempt to fight Voldemort when I heard he was to arise. I also admit, with reference to my defense, that the employment of the mole Mrs. Cecilia Frobisher was for the good of wizards and mole-wizard relations. She was the enticement, with her understanding of science, with which I intended to lure Lord Voldemort. Her discovery of the universal link was entirely a serendipitous event." "You used the female mole as bait?" exclaimed Fudge incredulously. "It was not set out to be. But as we did not know the manner of his return was going to be, we knew he would be attracted if he became aware that we were using mole science to mount an attack." "I attest that the defendant is sidestepping the issue," declared Umbridge, a glint in her eye as she addressed the Supreme Mugwump. "We need to know details of these meetings." "Certainly, I can provide you with first-hand recollections from my own memory if you will, Madam Prosecutor. However, I am sure the Supreme Mugwump does not expect me to recall every single one right now. I believe they will prove a tad tedious." "But the legality," began Umbridge, but she broke off as the Supreme Mugwump held up a hand. "I am given to understand," he clarified, in his high-pitched voice, "that a society which deals in wizards socializing is not as yet against the law in Great Britain." He turned to Dumbledore and continued, "That will not be necessary, Dumbledore. Please take your seat, Undersecretary." He added, casting a statuesque stare at Umbridge before glancing at the court usher, prompting confirmation of a name. "Umbridge," clarified the court usher, staring firmly at her. "Umbridge," finished Umbridge herself, sitting down firmly. Tabitha felt her exhale in annoyance as she sat next to her, an expression of frustration that Tabitha had heard many times, usually directed at her. Taking hold of the sleeve of Tabitha's best bay robe, Madame Mimonius, she clenched it in her grip as she fanned herself with her court parchment theatrically. Fudge was going red in the face too, but unlike Umbridge had remained standing. When he spoke again, Tabitha realized he had changed to a different tack. "It is in fact a duty to reveal all information to the court as requested," he continued, his voice slightly wavering now as he fought to keep it even. "However, I choose to overlook it in favor of a swift resolution of this matter. Now, from what you said previously, regarding your engagement of the mole dash. Mrs. Frobisher, are we given to understand that you do not deny your role in breaking the law?" "No, indeed I do not deny it," confirmed Dumbledore, nodding slowly. "I am the very last reciprocator. I knowingly contacted a mole, unknowing to our ways, and disclosed the existence of our world to her. I then proceeded to allow her to investigate our world with the object of creating a weapon powerful enough to defeat Lord Voldemort." A wave of ferocious whispering echoed around the court again. Next to Tabitha, Umbridge pulled her closer. "There. We have him," she whispered gleefully, letting go of her robe. "He has admitted wrongdoing. Maybe now we will see some action against him." Tabitha nodded dutifully towards Umbridge as she looked around the court, her eyes drawn to the court usher who was waving her hands to indicate silence was required. Tabitha felt Umbridge about to leave her seat to continue with the prosecution, but she sat back down quickly as Fudge continued to speak, his tone somber now, invoking a grave atmosphere to descend upon the proceedings. I can recall the day that such a term was described in a court of law like this one here today, where a wizard stood, describing the actions of a reciprocator. 1956. The Goblin Riots, he added hastily, making sure it was clear to Banaccord to which event he was referring. The Supreme Mugwump indicated his comprehension by nodded briefly. And you, Dumbledore, have the audacity to stand here and describe your revival of a role which was made illegal more than 200 years ago and whose very existence has threatened the exposure and ruin of our world on more than one occasion. Have reciprocators ever brought about the terror and horror that Voldemort himself has wrought? Have they ever caused wanton destruction and death? In the spirit of reciprocators, both ancient and modern, my actions have been only to stop the greatest threat that ever faced our world by employing a mole to solve it. There was a pause, lasting for what seemed like a good hour, but in reality, whatever reality meant here, was probably only a minute or so. Eventually the Minister for Magic spoke. Am I given to understand that you believed a mole could help defeat Lord Voldemort? The lilt in Fudge's voice seemed to indicate utter incredulity. It is the working together of moles and wizards that brought about our divorce. Separation was caused through collaboration, Dumbledore, rather than unity, or so I am led to believe by my team, whose services I have called upon in order to enrich my scant knowledge of such things. The differences between our races are many, any Anthropocerer could tell you such. This is why we had reciprocators, Cornelius, in order for mutual benefit to both societies. For cooperation and sharing of information. This is one thing we don't need, scoffed Fudge, one hand leaning on the dark wooden railing from his position at the front of the ministry area. It is such liberty of information that caused a Wizengamot many centuries ago to outlaw such practices, and for a further court to reiterate the dangers to moles of knowing this information. The 1956 Protection Act was brought about as a direct result of the actions of a so-called reciprocator. The mole population was considered to be at risk. More at risk now, wouldn't you agree, Cornelius, with the dangers that threaten us all? Would you have us not equip them to deal with their own protection? They are not animals. For a moment, Tabitha thought that the minister had not heard him. Then she watched in horrified fascination as redness flooded his face and he exploded with rage, hardly able to speak. Are you challenging my authority, Dumbledore? He managed, gripping the railing that he had so casually been caressing moments ago. You claim. Information has been lost by the ministry. Yes, it has. But one thing we do know is that you caused other law-abiding wizards to break the law. However, if you claim this collaboration was to aid mole defense, can you deny that one of your associates and friends with whom you collaborated was a werewolf? A collective gasp whooshed through the court, silenced quickly lest the spectators, the representatives, were no longer the merely to witness. They were fully engaged with the drama of the unfolding trial, missed anything vital. Indeed I do not. The wizard of whom you speak is in full control of his actions by means of the Wolfsbane potion. He is about as much of a danger to moles than a hat stand. Then I believe it is about time that I informed you, Dumbledore, that under the new security measures all half-breeds, werewolves, vampires, giants, trolls and other such dangerous life forms must register their existence with us formally. Those who have broken codes of practice to which they are bound will be interrogated and, if necessary, prosecuted. Tabitha knew he had gone too far. The smile of triumph that had originally played on his features had been replaced with one of surprise. Tabitha was aware that such a law was coming, but had no idea that it was already in force. The controversial Security Act. From what she had seen, it was very bureaucratic and restrictive, far more so than would have been tolerated before February. Around them the ministry representatives were awoken from their restful stupor at the sound of the words, turning to one another and voicing the same question that Tabitha herself had posed. A few shouts began as one or two of them who were having difficulty in comprehending exactly what the minister had said were turning to him, and Fudge turned to them, a smile of satisfaction lingering momentarily before he spoke. As of midnight yesterday, the new security laws, for which you have been in possession of a draft copy, come into force regarding protection from dangers to wizarding communities. Protection from half-breeds, shouted someone. If there is no threat to us from you know who, then why this law? Dangerous life forms. There is no threat, but you know how people panic. Anything that threatens our way of life. That's sensible. But did you read the draft? It says. No. Surely not. The chattering got louder, wizards around them bickering and arguing, until finally Benacord had no alternative than to return to his position standing on his chair. His voice boomed around the courtroom as he pointed his wand to his throat. Silence. Around Tabitha, wizards stopped abruptly, conversations left hanging in mid-sentence as the command from the highest legal-ranking wizard in the world pierced their consciousnesses. Even the inquisitors, who had not spoken amongst themselves, looked decidedly uncomfortable at the proceedings, the Prime Inquisitor looking about her furtively. As the Supreme Mugwump's command echoed to nothing, the Ministry wizards became inanimate, sitting back in their places without question and turning automatically back to the center of the chamber. All but one. Umbridge got resolutely to her feet. Smiling briefly at Benacord, she nodded towards the court usher, flapping her notes so she could see it before glancing down the parchment. What was your reason for wanting Mrs. Frobisher in particular in Hogwarts, Dumbledore? Umbridge continued, as if Fudge's declaration of the Act of Ministry had not been divulged. Was it her expertise as a mole? A naive attempt at offering choice and an all-round balanced education to our young students? I mean, of course, under normal circumstances your motives might be considered perfectly legitimate, but surely you can see that your argument does not hold water if you claim that your prime interest was the protection of your students, the children. Here Umbridge looked at the Ministry representatives before turning back to Dumbledore. In your care. But if that were the case, then surely bringing dangerous thinking as well as dangerous events to their school was entirely the opposite of what you claim. As to the new Security Act, replied Dumbledore, looking at the Ministry representatives and nodding slowly. That is indeed a contradiction in terms when those students and the Wizard Society it asserts to protect includes the non-renewal of mole permits, and a limit of time for those fortunate to have wizarding children. This time, thought Tabitha, it was Dumbledore who had gone too far. At the uproar that was now ensuing, Fudge raised his hands, indicating he wanted quiet from his employees. Yes, for security. He continued, over the din, which is needed considering the actions of Albus Dumbledore, inviting in a mole to our school, a place of vulnerable underage wizards. I thought that it was wizards who were the danger to moles, said Dumbledore quietly, but Fudge ignored him and continued to address the Ministry wizards. Even now the Ministry is overstretched, with employees working tirelessly over lists in order to establish which moles should know what, altering the damage that has been caused by Dumbledore's foolish actions. In light of the recent security changes and that Dumbledore has been holding meetings of a society composed of wizards to talk about heaven knows what, the ardent wish of my personal friends and colleagues is for the defense of our world and all we hold dear, replied Dumbledore, addressing Benacord, which hopefully is still legal, under the new security measures. Tabitha Penright saw Dumbledore glance across to Benacord, and she could have sworn the Supreme Mugwump nodded briefly. Then she looked back at the minister, who appeared to have concluded that he had said enough on the matter of the Security Act. The minister didn't say it wasn't, Dumbledore, said Umbridge, returning to her feet and glancing pityingly at Fudge. We are getting off the point, Supreme Mugwump Benacord. Turning towards the defendant, Umbridge pushed on. Is it, or is it not still illegal to knowingly set up a reciprocal relationship with a mole? Murmurings began now from the inquisitors, uncertain if her new direct approach was something that they agreed with, but they had little time to deliberate as the prosecutor forged ahead, addressing them now, rather than the Supreme Mugwump, Fudge or Dumbledore. "Then I ask you, can we not proceed to what is to be done about it, rather than quibble about the legalities?" Plainly and simply, Dumbledore has admitted to being a reciprocator. This time, the mutterings that came from the inquisitors seemed to Tabitha to be more in agreement with Umbridge. "Then we need to hear full involvement of how the Mullin Wizard affairs, Dumbledore." Triumph. Tabitha could hear it in her superior's voice, and she looked across at Benacord. Umbridge's forthright stance was clearly what the Supreme Mugwump was looking for. He nodded in Dumbledore's direction and waved a hand. "Very well." Dumbledore got to his feet. "I employed Mrs. Cecilia Jane Frobisher as a scientist. I instructed her to use science to investigate magic with the intent of developing a weapon to use against Lord Voldemort." "And this was a ruse," promoted Umbridge. "A what?" "A ruse, a cover for her other work." Umbridge folded her arms accusingly. Dumbledore smiled, in apparent comprehension. "Oh yes, you mean the old mole medicament that she developed." "You allowed her to teach our children, she is a mole," declared Umbridge crossly. "And an excellent teacher she was too. I am sorry to lose her, but aside from her discovering the universal link, I do have a very effective tincture for my chest." "You allowed her enough freedom to find the so-called universal link?" blasted Fudge, from his hitherto silent position at the front of the court, erupting in a blaze of fury at Dumbledore's evasion of the point. "The connection moles and wizards." "Yes," replied Dumbledore serenely. "During the process of finding my cough remedy, I'd tried everything magical and it was just no use, and I recalled a cousin of my mother's talking about a time when he was a lad dash." "I hold it was not," snapped back Umbridge, the notes in her hand quivering with unalloyed ire. "I hold it was some harebrained scheme involving Harry Potter and he who must not be named." A cough of surprise came from the Germanic witch from the Inquisitor bench as the court usher got to her feet. Umbridge fell silent. From many of these accounts it would appear that Mrs. Frobisher attacked he who must not be named in the guise of a Death Eater, having taken a highly concentrated dose of Polyjuice potion which left her in a severe state of ill health. As she spoke, from her position beneath the Supreme Mugwump's chair, all eyes were on Dumbledore, witches and wizards as one, holding their collective breath as they awaited confirmation of the wildest story of all to come out of the last 4 months. Dumbledore looked at Benacord before looking round at the expressions of rapt fascination and awe as the representatives of the British magical community waited. Eventually, arguably the most powerful wizard in the world spoke. "It is true, Supreme Mugwump. Cecilia Frobisher did indeed face Voldemort with the objective of defeating him at great personal risk, a decision she made entirely alone." Dumbledore's words echoed around the chamber as the motionless atmosphere endured for what to Tabitha seemed like eons. No one spoke or moved as the sentence that they had all heard settled into consciousnesses. "There, well, that proves it," declared Umbridge, breaking the silence. From Tabitha's side the large witch got to her feet, gesturing her incredulity. "It's such a ridiculousness, a mole attacking you know who? Ha! It wouldn't surprise me if it is all a figment of his imagination." From the rising noise of the ministry representatives around them the debate began to be debated. Could a mole seriously have challenged you know who? It sounded preposterous. "Then it is also a figment of the imaginations of these wizards," said the court usher, summoning a towering pile of evidence into the empty space 6 inches above her hand, the papers higher up swaying and blowing at the higher altitudes. "Indeed so, madam," continued Dumbledore, nodding towards the usher, "and once it was clear what she was doing I had no choice but to call upon my colleagues, friend and associates to aid her cause. For it was quite outlandish to think that she could survive alone. We have yet to discuss the legality of the organization, interrupted Fudge, raising his hand and pointing a finger towards Dumbledore as his face began to redden again with infuriation, and why he insists that you know who has returned. As he spoke, the pile of papers that the usher had evoked moved slowly in his direction, threatening to spill if a chance breeze should knock it, and he eyed them suspiciously as it neared. And evidence from a handful of half-blind fools is hardly enough, continued Umbridge, folding her arms in self-acclaimed victory. These are from at least 50 wizards who have sworn a testimony that they have seen Lord Voldemort up to as many as 12 days after the events of February 24th, at least a third of whom cited him before Christmas and during the Mole deaths at Halloween. Although he appears to have gone into hiding, Dolores, he trod his path rather noisily. The usher's words were clear and plain as they had always been when she was addressing the head girl of her house, Ravenclaw, 1952 to 1959, and Dolores Umbridge shot her a look of detestation but said nothing. Ignoring Umbridge's wordlessness, the usher continued. The evidence we have procured cannot be ignored. Whether he who must not be named arose in February at Hogwarts or somewhere else, he did arise and terrorized more than a few wizards and muggles, as your own reports from Ministry errors and befuddlers testify. So he did arise, said Umbridge stiffly, an eye on the usher across from her. That is hereby established, Araminta. Beside her Tabitha felt Umbridge turn, surveying the Ministry wizards before looking over to Fudge. The evidence we have procured has been used to only one end. For security. This made sense, thought Tabitha, nodding slowly to herself as Umbridge's pink-lined robe flapped next to her. They had already wasted so much time searching for Cecilia Frobisher, wading through oceans of paperwork in the process, that the Ministry had to act much sooner than expected, a quick fix for everything. It was as Vincento had told her, the Ministry did not want to declare openly that Voldemort was back, and wanted to allay fears. But it also wanted to know what the bloody hell Dumbledore had been up to behind its back, and give him a public slap on the wrists. Finding Cecilia Frobisher was top priority in order to do both those things. Which made sense that the memos and scraps of information she had been receiving over the past few weeks had been to do with Dumbledore's trial and with locating Cecilia Frobisher. Tabitha recognized within the trial elements of her own work carried out diligently and without error when, she thought testily, she should have been solving her mystery. However, as Umbridge had pointed out, using tones of pitying disappointment that she had reprieved for today's proceedings, that she had failed to actually locate the mole. There is still the matter of the potion, Supreme Mugwump. The potion that the mole devised for Dumbledore '*S. illness. Which he has yet to produce, as requested, for our examination. Tabitha was brought back to earth by Fudge's cool, calm words. The minister was speaking slowly and clearly to Benacord again, and clearly he wished to explore each matter that had been an obvious nuisance to him over the past few months. You mean this? At the center of the chamber Dumbledore moved a few steps towards the front of the court, holding up a vial that he had drawn from his pocket. Immediately every wizard and witch present turned their attention to the contents of Dumbledore's right hand. Test it out by all means. I'm sure the Department of Mysteries can put aside other less important works to deal with this blend of herbs and sugar. As he spoke, Dumbledore tossed it in the direction of Umbridge, who caught it as if it were an incendiary device, before passing it towards Tabitha. She looked at the tiny bottle which contained a clear, colorless liquid before stowing it away into her robes, trying to ignore the stares of her colleagues. How do we know it is what you say it is, Dumbledore? Asked Umbridge. You don't trust me, Undersecretary Umbridge? Minister Fudge? Dumbledore smiled between them, his expression, Tabitha thought, one of highest sincerity. I don't trust a mole who has concocted goodness knows what, who has been at liberty in our world for heaven knows how long, and has done Merlin knows what to the minds of our children. She is #1 most wanted mole for a reason, Dumbledore, and we need to know the universal link. And when I asked you if you wanted to meet her, Cornelius, just a few short months ago, you were not inclined to do so even when she was lying in the hospital wing, recovering from injuries sustained in tasks above and beyond the call of duty. HMPH. Instead of replying, Fudge surveyed the court before returning to his large chair just to the lower right of Ben Accord, and he folded his arms firmly. The Supreme Mugwump paused before getting to his feet once more and holding his wand to his throat. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, you now have your defense. Any witnesses you would like to call may now be called and their testimony heard. There are none, Supreme Mugwump. Is there anything you wish to say in your defense, Albus? Ben Accord leaned forward, whispering loudly in Dumbledore's direction. As he did so, Dumbledore looked at him, bowing his head solemnly before turning to address the Inquisitors. Only this. I am the last reciprocator. I reciprocated the knowledge of a mole called Cecilia Frobisher, who through her work under my jurisdiction at Hogwarts discovered what is being called the universal link, that is the link between moles and wizards. Can you believe it? Whispered Umbridge to Tabitha, nudging her just in case she wasn't actually listening to the words that Dumbledore was saying. He's rid now, that's for sure. Tabitha glanced at her and nodded in agreement before looking back at the chamber floor to where Dumbledore was still giving testimony. Also, that on the night of Saturday 24th of February 1997 Lord Voldemort attempted to and successfully regained full strength despite numerous attempts to stop him, including from like-minded wizards to myself who believe that whatever the means he should be stopped for the good of everyone. What I have done has been carried out with this assertion, always, borne in mind. The Inquisitors will now deliberate. Ben Accord turned to the group of 12 witches and wizards in their plum-colored robes who had got to their feet and were facing him. Albus Dumbledore. On the one hand, if it is decreed by the representatives of the International Wizengamot here today that your testimony against that which the Ministry has supplied is a constructed of fabrications, you will spend the rest of your life in Azkaban. Do you understand this? Dumbledore closed his eyes and nodded his head. If it is found that you are telling the truth, the charge of reciprocation, to which you have openly admitted, will be hereafter sentenced. Another nod. It is worrying to my mind that in Britain there is a mole loose who is unbefuddled and who knows, well, perhaps more than any mole should know. That leaves the question of how we must decide how to proceed. 88,888,888. In the dimly lit corridor that led from the door of the Wizengamot chamber, the Ministry representatives began to mingle. The trial had been called to a halt in order for the Inquisitors under the Supreme Mugwump's direction to discuss the evidence set before them and decide on a course of action. The whole business of deliberation was, as with a national trial, carried out behind closed doors, and once Ben Accord had dismissed all but those dozen witches and wizards chosen to make a judgment over Dumbledore's and other people's fates, the 2 doors to the chamber had been sealed from the inside by the Supreme Mugwump himself. Not all of the Ministry representatives were happy to mill and mix in the mahogany-paneled hallway, however. Indeed, even though many of them would be happy to have slunk back off to their offices to meet with colleagues from departments, throw handfuls of green powder into fireplaces, or summon post-imps to dispatch hastily scribbled notes, they were bound by the oath they had borne that morning, which was to witness the full trial in its entirety as impartial observers. Some of the representatives therefore were engaged in a variety of activities with the hope of staving off the impending boredom that was soon to come. It had been known even with national matters within the Ministry that the court could take a good few hours until they had come to a conclusion. In fact, it was not unheard of for Ministry representatives to be left in the corridor for nearly a week. Bannet vs. Ministry, 1922. Around her, the wizards who were in the trial were speaking noisily about the proceedings.